Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel, where everything you're about to hear and see has been done in one take. I'm your host, the One Take Man. And as I've promised you the last time I had this background, I'm kind of my schedule is a little bit all over the place, so for a variety of reasons. Um, I will now be looking at the Wikipedia article for the Stonewall riots. And I have to say, when I first looked into it, I was surprised to see it is quite a bit more, quite a bit bigger than I thought it would be. So unlike my initial plans, I will not be able to go through all of it in one piece, the way I intended it. So instead, I'll be going through it piece by piece. First of all, the top and background section, and then in maybe one or two more videos, I'll be covering the rest. I lean towards it being two more. And also because this is Wikipedia and they have some standards with regards to how exactly they should structure their articles, and this one respects that quite well, given it's featured. I will also deliver my comments on it, because I think that additional context might become relevant occasionally. So let's so anyway, now that I'm done with the preamble, I'll start going through the article, starting with this sidebar here. Stonewall riots, part of events leading to gay liberation and modern LGBTQ rights movement. To what extent the gays have actually been liberated is debatable, but let's move on. And this is the only known photograph taken during the first night of the riots by freelance photographer Joseph Ambrosini. Shows LGBTQ youth scuffling with police. Okay, and there's this source right here. Nice. Date took place from June 28th to July 3rd, 1969. So, yeah. just like the actual Stonewall riots, my video about the Stonewall riots will go a little bit beyond initial expectations. Location: Stonewall in New York City, and there are even some coordinates. Northern latitude, western longitude, if I'm not mistaken. Caused by police raid on the Stonewall Inn, specifically, and general repression of LGBTQ rights more broadly. Okay, I'm glad that is where the responsibility for the right is, for this endeavor is actually placed. So good job, Wikipedia there. Goals: gay liberation and LGBTQ rights in the United States. Well, hard to say whether or not that is the case in this specific incident, like in this specific case, like just this one riot deciding gay rights in the entirety of the United States. Not really the case. However, it does mean that within one community at least there are gay rights. Methods: rioting and street protests. The parties: the New York Police Department, more precisely 4 precincts and the Tactical Patrol Force. And on the other side, we have Stonewall Inn patrons and other sympathizers, as well as their numbers. I'm kind of surprised there's no casualties section on this in this header, but that's beside the point. Also, this is part of a series on LGBTQ people, more specifically from the history section of this series. Anyway, going back to the beginning, let's start reading, shall we? The Stonewall riots, also known as the Stonewall Uprising, Stonewall Rebellion, Stonewall Revolution, or simply Stonewall, were a series of spontaneous riots and demonstrations against a police raid that took place in the early morning hours of June 28th, 1969, at the Stonewall Inn, in the Greenwich Village neighborhood of Lower Manhattan in New York City. Although the demonstrations were not the first time American LGBTQ people fought back against government-sponsored persecution of sexual minorities, yes, the police are sponsored by government. They are a part of government. Because they do law enforcement, which is one of the 3 branches of government. Hopefully that's something conservatives will eventually learn. The Stonewall riots marked a new beginning for the gay rights movement in the United States and around the world. And we have here the first note. Descriptors in this article reflect terminology that was used at the time. And yeah, that's a disclaimer I also have to make because I will occasionally be quoting stuff from this article and quoting especially various sources from that particular period. Sources which, even though is meant in support of queer minorities, might not necessarily reflect sensibilities of modern language users. So in that sense, I'd like to apologize in advance. Moving ahead. The one-word unifying term for people in same-sex relationships or not conforming to gender norms in the 1950s through the early 1980s was homosexual or gay. See gay liberation. Later, 70s, 80s, this was expanded by many groups to lesbian and gay, then by 90s and noughties to lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender. And, well, truth be told, the actual LGBT acronym is quite a bit longer and encompasses quite a few more groups. And there is some level of overlap between the groups, but that's besides the point right now. American gays and lesbians in the 1950s and 60s faced a legal system more anti-homosexual than some other Western and Eastern Bloc countries. Another note: except for Illinois, which decriminalized sodomy in 1961, homosexual acts, even between hopefully this will be the only word that stumps me. Consenting adults acting in private homes were a criminal offense in every U.S. state at the time the Stonewall riots occurred. And now it's time for my quote voice. An adult convicted of the crime of having sex with another consenting adult in the privacy of his or her home could get anywhere from a light fine to 5, 10, or 20 years, or even life in prison. In 1971, the 20 states had sex psychopath laws that permitted the detaining of homosexuals for that reason alone. In Pennsylvania and California, sex offenders could be committed to psychiatric institutions for life. And in 7 states, they could be castrated. Castration emetics, whatever that is. Is that vomit inducing? Let's see. Okay, doesn't specify. Hypnosis, electroshock therapy, and lobotomies were used by psychiatrists to attempt to cure homosexuals through the 1950s and 60s. That's not something that can be cured. Anyway, moving on. Early homophile groups in the US sought to prove that gay people could be assimilated into society, because yeah, every minority rights group has assimilationists. And they favored non-confrontational education for homosexuals and heterosexuals alike. The last years of the 1960s, however, were very contentious, as many social movements were active, including the African American Civil Rights Movement, the counterculture of the 1960s, and anti-war demonstrations. These influences, along with the liberal environment of Greenwich Village, served as catalysts for the Stonewall riots. Very few establishments welcomed openly gay people in the 1950s and 60s. Those that did were often bars, although bar owners and managers were rarely gay. The Stonewall Inn was owned by the mafia and catered to an assortment of patrons, popular among the poorest and most marginalized people in the gay community. Drag queens, representatives of a newly self-aware transgender community, effeminate young men, hustlers, and homeless youth. Yeah, the typical assortment of undesirables of a society. And this actually gets me and here I want to actually get into a segue to someone you might not expect, C.S. Lewis. Because when trying to, in his experiments with Christian apologia, he was trying to explain, why the sayings of Jesus should be taken seriously, and why Jesus as the Son of God should be taken seriously. And to that end, he invented the Jesus trilemma, the question of whether Jesus is a liar, a loon, or a lord. Again, this is his language of the time. Something you'll notice about this trilemma is that it actually applies quite well to the categories of people that are generally excluded from a society. First of all, there are the liars, who are common punks, thieves, ne'er-do-wells, the general kind of a certain subsection of people who would generally uh, 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 seek advantages wherever they can get them, whether that be within the whether that be within the social agreement upon which a society is founded, or outside of it. The or outside of it, yeah, the liars. Then there are the loons, or those who are otherwise mentally ill, or whose well-being is in some way challenged by the organization of the institution itself for whatever reason. And then there are lords, the actual the actual architects or inspirational figures of change, who can to some extent bring reform to the social order, whether not maybe not just or reform, or more broadly change, whether that be through peaceful means or otherwise. These groups always bound to be are always bound to be always bound to be represented outside of society in some manner. Sorry about that. And and because of that commonality of being outside society, they often congregate together. Because in the words of Kyle from Browsfield High, who I know has a last name, but I don't remember it anymore. Oh, Kyle Calgren. You cannot define who is within a society without defining who is outside of it. Anyway, with that out of the way, let's get back to the actual video. My actual video. Police raids on gay bars were routine in the 1960s, but officers quickly lost control of the situation at the Stonewall Inn and attracted a crowd that was incited to riot. Tensions between New York City police and gay residents of Greenwich Village erupted into more protests the next evening and again several nights later. Within weeks, village residents quickly organized into activist groups to concentrate efforts on establishing places for gays and lesbians to be open about their sexual orientation without fear of being arrested. Sexual orientation is, funnily enough, being highlighted. Okay. But that's not the subject for this video. Following the Stonewall riots, sexual minorities in New York City faced gender, class, and generational obstacles to becoming a cohesive community. Over the following weeks and months, they initiated politically active social organizations and launched publications that spoke openly about rights for gay and trans people. The first anniversary of the riots was marked by peaceful demonstrations in several American cities that have since grown to become pride parades. Stonewall National Monument was established at the site in 2016, 47 years later, but still, it is good that it went into effect. Today, pride events are held annually throughout the world towards the end of June to mark the Stonewall riots. Again, I can confirm that. That is something I can confirm. Not necessarily due to participation, but more due to being, connected to the news. And now let's dig into background, and I'll let you know there's a lot to cover here. So, homosexuality in 20th century United States. For further information, see LGBTQ history in the United States, as well as Lavender Scare, which is kind of like a Red Scare, only instead of the commies are coming to indoctrinate your kids, it's the gays are coming to, I don't know, screw your kids, something. Following the social upheaval of World War II, many people in the United States felt a fervent desire to restore the pre-war social order and hold off the forces of change, according to historian Barry Adam. I would have a lot to comment on this subject, but it would be a little bit too much of a mess for now. So I'm just gonna let it sit, even though I think we can acknowledge that is not the whole truth. Spurred by the national emphasis on anti-communism, Senator Joseph McCarthy, because of course it was McCarthy, conducted hearings searching for communists in the U.S. government, the U.S. Army, and other government-funded agencies and institutions, leading to a national paranoia. McCarthy was always has also gone through Hollywood, which does not fit any of the any definition of a government-funded agency. But whatever. Anarchists, communists, and other people deemed un-American and subversive were considered security risks. Gay men and lesbians were included in this list by the U.S. State Department on the theory that they were susceptible to blackmail. So you decided to make them more susceptible to blackmail because of that? Well, hold on just a minute. And I'm back from an interruption. Yeah, well, that's what happens when I film outside of my usual place. I get interrupted. Anyway, where was I? Oh yeah. Gay men and lesbians were included in this list by the U.S. State Department on the fear they were susceptible to blackmail. So let's make them more susceptible to blackmail, because why the fuck not? Yeah, this is what happens when you put feelings over facts. In 1950, a Senate investigation chaired by Clyde R. Hoey noted in a report, "It is generally believed that those who engage in overt acts of perversion lack the emotional stability of normal persons," and said all of the government's intelligence agencies are in complete agreement that sex perverts in government constitute security risks. This is a lot of hearsay and a lot of "I believe," not a lot of "I can prove," or this is what we've found. So yeah, they're just wrong, but they can't even recognize that they're wrong. Between 1947 and 1950, 1,700 federal job applications were denied, 4,380 people were discharged from the military, and 420 were fired from their government jobs for being suspected homosexuals. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, the Federal Bureau of Investigation and police departments kept lists of known homosexuals and their favorite establishments and friends. The U.S. Post Office kept track of addresses where material pertaining to homosexuality was mailed. State and local governments followed suit. Bars catering to gay men and lesbians were shut down, and their customers were arrested and exposed in newspapers. Cities performed sweeps to rid neighborhoods, parks, bars, and beaches of gay people. They outlawed the wearing of opposite-gender clothes, and universities expelled instructors suspected of being homosexual. Okay, this is government tyranny, conservatives. This is, this is what we're talking. This is what people talk about when they talk about government overreach. This is the kind of thing that should really piss you off. Not the thing you should agree with, even though I imagine most of you do. And if you don't, well then go ahead and prove me wrong. In 1952, the American Psychiatric Association listed homosexuality in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, big mistake, as a mental disorder. A large-scale study of homosexuality in 1962 was used to justify the inclusion of the disorder as a supposed pathological hidden fear of the opposite sex caused by traumatic parent-child relationships. Yeah, that's bullshit. This view was widely influential in the medical profession, wrongly so. In 1956, the psychologist Evelyn Hooker, a very unfortunate name, performed a study that compared the happiness and well-adjusted nature of self-identified homosexual men with heterosexual men and found no difference. Her study stunned the medical community and made her a hero to many gay men and lesbians, but homosexuality remained in the DSM until 1974. Yeah, unsurprising. Homophile activism. In response to this trend, two organizations formed independently of each other to advance the cause of gay men and lesbians, and formed independently of each other to advance the cause of gay men and lesbians and provide opportunities where they could socialize without fear of being arrested. Los Angeles area homosexuals created the Mattachine Society, I assume that's how that's pronounced, in 1950, in the home of communist activist Harry Hay. Their objectives were to unify homosexuals, educate them, provide leadership, and assist sexual deviants with legal troubles. Facing enormous oppositions to their radical approach, this is not a radical approach. This is, this is basically milquetoast liberalism. I don't see how that's radical. In 1953, the Mattachine shifted their focus to assimilation and respectability. Generally a mistake, but go on. They reasoned that they would change more minds about homosexuality by proving that gay men and lesbians were normal people, no different from heterosexual. Soon after, several women in San Francisco met in their living room to form the Daughters of uh, Bilitis, I think, is how it's supposed to be pronounced, for lesbians. Although the 8 women who created the DOB initially came together to be able to have a safe place to dance, as the DOB grew, they developed similar goals to the Mattachine and urged their members to assimilate into general society. One of the first challenges to government repression came in 1953. An organization named One Inc. published a magazine called One, of course, and it's italicized, funnily enough. The U.S. Postal Service refused to mail its August issues, which concerned homosexual people in heterosexual marriages, on the grounds that material was obscene despite it being covered in brown paper wrapping. Even if it wasn't, like, did the issue itself actually have actually have any obscene imagery on its cover, or is it, or is it like, especially because obscenity is remarkably hard to prove. But then again, they might not have known that in 1953. Whatever. The case eventually went to the Supreme Court, which in 1958 ruled that One Inc. could mail its materials through the Postal Service. And yeah, of course they can. Next up, homophile organizations, as homosexual groups self-identified in this era. Okay. And also homophile is highlighted. Yeah, not gonna go into that. Grew in number and spread to the East Coast. Gradually, members of these organizations grew bolder. That reminds me. No, the example I was thinking went the other way when it came to the coasts. Anyway, as I was saying, Frank Kameny, I assume that's how that name is spoken, founded the Mattachine of Washington, D.C. He had been fired from the U.S. Army Map Service for being a homosexual. Why would people who think in homosexuals about stereotypes not want one of them in a position to illustrate? Seriously? Anyway, and sued unsuccessfully to be reinstated. Kameny wrote that homosexuals were no different from heterosexuals, often aiming his efforts at mental health professionals, some of whom attended Mattachine and DOB meetings telling members they were abnormal. Yeah, not surprised such a thing would happen. And I can say both were wrong, but for different reasons. Well, okay. One of them was trying to do the, was trying to play the politeness game. The other one was just being rude, and and yeah, just rude. Where was I? Oh yeah. In 1965, news on Cuban prison work camps for homosexuals inspired Mattachine, New York, and DC to organize protests at the United Nations and the White House. Some of the demonstrations were then held also at other government buildings. The purpose was to protest the treatment of gay people in Cuba and U.S. employment discrimination. That is generally a good idea, because if you'll remember the main framing of the Western and Eastern Bloc, especially when it came to the conflict between them within the within the Western Bloc, was that the Western Bloc stands for freedom, self-determination, and all of that stuff, whereas the Eastern Bloc stands for its leader, stands for everything to be focused as the leader wants it to be. The framing within the Eastern Bloc was that the Western Bloc was an expansionist conqueror, and the Eastern Bloc was simply protecting itself. Or at least that is what I can, or that is at least what I have been told about it from people who have, lived in those times. But that's a little bit beyond the scope of this video. These pickets shocked many gay people and upset some of the leadership of the Mattachine and the DOB. Why would it? They're just exercising their First Amendment rights. That shouldn't be too shocking. At the same time, demonstrations in the civil rights movement and opposition to the Vietnam War all grew in prominence, frequency, and severity. I resent this word being used here. I would swap it out for impact. throughout the 1960s, as did their confrontations with police forces. In case you're wondering whether, well, why why the lights on me changed quite radically, well, I'm right in front of a window, and in a room that is otherwise quite dark, and I guess the sky is a little bit overcast, so you'll have the occasional cloud rolling, blocking out the sun. Anyway, moving ahead, earlier resistance and riots. Main article, list of LGBTQ actions in the United States prior to the Stonewall riots. See also Cooper Donuts riot and Compton's Cafeteria riot. On the outer fringes of a few small gay communities were people who challenged traditional gender norms. Effeminate men, masculine women, or people who dressed and lived in ways that contrasted with their sex assigned at birth. The gender nonconformists, either part-time or full-time. At the time, nomenclature classified them as transvestites. Thus, as the most visible representatives for sexual minorities, they belied the carefully crafted image promoted by the Mattachine Society and the DOB, which sought to portray homosexuals capable of fitting within a normative society. I'm not sure belied is really a good best word to use here. Maybe maybe defied, maybe ran against would work better. Just saying. The Mattachine and DOB believed that being arrested for wearing clothing normative of the opposite gender was akin to the struggle of homophile organizations. Similar but distinctly separate. So much for the First Amendment, freedom of expression and all that. Gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender people rioted at the Cooper Donuts Cafe in Los Angeles in 1959 to counteract police harassment. In a larger 1966 event in San Francisco, drag queens, hustlers, and trans women were sitting in Compton's cafeteria when the police arrived to arrest people appearing to be physically male but were presenting as women. A riot ensued. Cafeteria patrons were slinging cups, plates, and saucers, breaking the plexiglass windows in the front of the restaurant. I am slightly impressed by that, actually. They returned several days later to break the windows again shortly after they were replaced. Professor Susan Stryker classifies the Compton's Cafeteria riot as an act of anti-transgender discrimination rather than an act of discrimination against sexual orientation, and connects the uprising to the intersectionality of gender, race, and class in relation to sexual orientation, which were being downplayed by contemporary homophile organizations. Yeah, I'm not going to comment on that. I simply do not know enough to say one way or another. It marked the beginning of transgender activism in San Francisco. Okay, let's see. Greenwich Village. The Manhattan neighborhoods of Greenwich Village and Harlem were home to sizable gay and lesbian populations after World War I, when people who had served in the military took advantage of the opportunity to settle in larger cities. The enclaves of gay men and lesbians, described by a newspaper story as short-haired women and long-haired men. No, sorry, should have used my old-timey voice. Short-haired women and long-haired men developed a distinct subculture through the following 2 decades. Prohibition inadvertently benefited gay establishments, as drinking alcohol was pushed underground along with other behaviors considered immoral. New York City passed laws against homosexuality in public and private businesses, but because alcohol was in high demand, speakeasies and impromptu drinking establishments were so numerous and temporary that authorities were unable to police them all. However, police raids continued, resulting in the closure of iconic establishments such as Eve's Hangout in 1926. Okay, not exactly sure what the relevance of this, one example site being cited is, really is, but go on. The social repression of the 1950s resulted in a cultural revolution in Greenwich Village. A cohort of poets, later named the Beat Poets, wrote about the evils of the social organization at the time, glorifying anarchy, drugs, and hedonistic pleasures. Great, great stuff. Over unquestioning social compliance, consumerism, and closed-mindedness. Of them, Allen Ginsberg and William S. Burroughs, both Greenwich Village residents, also wrote bluntly and honestly about homosexuality. Their writings attracted sympathetic liberal-minded people, as well as homosexuals looking for a community. By the early 1960s, a campaign to rid New York City of gay bars was in full effect by order of Mayor Robert F. Wagner, or should I say Wagner? Which one sounds more evocative of someone who would want to screw gay people over? Who was concerned about the image of the city in preparation for the 1964 World's Fair. What is people existing shameful to you? Really? Anyway, the city revoked the liquor licenses of the bars, and undercover police officers worked to entrap as many homosexual men as possible. Entrapment usually consisted of an undercover officer who found a man in a bar or public park, and engaged him in conversation. If the conversation headed toward the possibility that they might leave together, or the officer bought the man a drink, he was arrested for solicitation. He, the man, not the officer. One story in the New York Post described an arrest in a gym locker room where the officer grabbed his crotch, moaning, and a man who asked him if he was all right was arrested. How exactly would that? I'm trying to figure out how that exactly worked. Is there a news article on that? No, just a book quote. Anyway, few lawyers would defend cases as undesirable as these, and some of those lawyers kicked back their fees to the arresting officer. Okay. The Mattachine Society succeeded in getting newly elected Mayor John Lindsay to John Lindsay to end the campaign of police entrapment in New York City. Well, that's good. Straight cops presenting themselves as honeypots is too weird for words. Going on. They had a more difficult time with the New York State Liquor Authority, however. While no laws prohibited serving homosexuals, courts allowed the SLA discretion in approving and revoking liquor licenses for businesses that might become disorderly. Yeah, of course they did. Despite the high population of gay men and lesbians who called Greenwich Village home, very few places existed other than bars where they were able to congregate openly without being harassed or arrested. In 1966, the New York Mattachine held a sip-in at a Greenwich Village bar named Julius, which was frequented by gay men, to illustrate the discrimination homosexuals faced. Was that? Oh yeah. There was a newspaper article being quoted. None of the bars frequented by gay men and lesbians were owned by gay people. Almost all of them were owned and controlled by organized crime, who treated regulars poorly, watered down the liquor, and overcharged for drinks. However, they also paid off police to prevent frequent raids. Yeah, see what I said earlier about liars, loons, and lords. Stonewall Inn itself. The Stonewall Inn, located at 51 and 53 Christopher Street, along with several other establishments in the city, was owned by the Genovese crime family. In 1966, 3 members of the mafia invested $3,500 to turn the Stonewall Inn into a gay bar, after it had been a restaurant and a nightclub for heterosexuals. Once a week, a police officer would collect envelopes of cash as a payoff known as a gayola, as the Stonewall Inn had no liquor license. It had no running water behind the bar. 30 glasses were run through tubs of water and immediately reused. There were no fire exits, and the toilets overran consistently. Yes. Yeah, neglectful owners, what can I say? Though the bar was not used for prostitution, drug sales and other black market activities took place. Of course they did. It was the only bar for gay men in New York City where dancing was allowed. Dancing was its main draw since its reopening as a gay club. Well, that's fine, I guess. Visitors to the Stonewall in 1969 were greeted by a bouncer who inspected them through a peephole in the door. The legal drinking age was 18, and to avoid unwittingly letting in undercover police, who were called Lily Law, Alice Bluegown, or Betty Badge. Okay, those are actually some funny nicknames. Visitors would have to be known by the doorman or look gay. I'm not exactly sure what look gay means in this circumstance. Did that mean just like having an item of clothing that they could hide under regular clothing, and then when they showed up at the peephole, like they would pull it out, like say an ascot or something? Also, I can't help but wonder if the handkerchief code had already come into effect by 1969, and whether it would make sense to have a guy who shows up at a peephole turn around so so the bouncer could see that there's a handkerchief hanging out. Just saying, something that could happen. Patrons were required to sign their names in a book to prove that the bar was a private bottle club, but they rarely signed their real names. Of course they didn't. There were two dance floors in the Stonewall. The interior was painted black, making it very dark inside with pulsing gel lights or black lights. Of course, very funky. Then again, it is the late 60s and it's a gay bar, of course it would be funky. If police were spotted, regular white lights were turned on, signaling that everyone should stop dancing or touching. In the rear of the bar was a smaller room frequented by queens. It was one of two bars where effeminate men who wore makeup and teased their hair, though dressed in men's clothing, could go. Only a few people in drag were allowed in by the bouncers. The customers were 98% male. 98% male. But a few lesbians sometimes came to the bar, for whatever reason. Younger homeless adolescent males who slept in nearby Christopher Park would often try to get in so customers would buy them drinks. Of course they did. The age of the clientele ranged between the upper teens and early 30s, and the racial mix was attributed among mainly white with black and Hispanic patrons. I wonder how that mirrors the distribution of New York as a whole. I imagine modern New York is definitely a little bit different, but what about New York at the time? Because of its mix of people, its location, and the attraction of dancing, the Stonewall Inn was known by many as the gay bar in the city. Yeah, of course it is. Police raids on gay bars were frequent, occurring on average once a month for each bar. Many bars kept extra liquor in a secret panel behind a bar or in a car down a block to facilitate resuming business as quickly as possible if alcohol was seized. Of course, that's a good idea, in general. Bar management usually knew about raids beforehand due to police tip-offs. Oh. Well, yeah, that's what the gayola is for. And raids occurred early enough in the evening that business could commence after the police had finished. During a typical raid, the lights were turned on and customers were lined up and their identification cards checked. Those without identification or dressed in full drag were arrested. Others were allowed to leave. I hope you heard the the quotations around allowed. Some of the men, including those in drag, used their draft cards as identification, because reasons. Women were required to wear free pieces of feminine clothing and would be arrested if found not wearing them. Typically, employees and management of the bars were also arrested. The period immediately before June 28, 1969 was marked by frequent raids of local bars, including a raid at the Stonewall Inn on the Tuesday before the riots, and the closing of the Checkerboard, the Telestar, and two other clubs in Greenwich Village. So yeah, the battle lines were quite clearly getting drawn at that point. And that's all I have time for now, so join me next week when I'll be getting into the actual meat of this video, the riots themselves. Until then, however, I would like to say thank you for your attention, and if you've enjoyed the presentation so far, well then please like the video, maybe even share it wherever you think other people will also like the video. If there is anything you'd like to add, either to my presentation or to the material I've been talking about, that's what the comment section is for. And if you want to see when my next video gets released, well then please subscribe. And ideally also ring the bell or do whatever else YouTube will ask of you in order to keep you notified. I also have a main channel where I primarily talk about book-related and literature topics, a link to which you can find in the description down below, right past my social media links, which I also suggest you check out should you choose to. If that isn't something you'd find interesting, then I suggest you stay on this channel and go for my extensive backlog of a variety of materials. Some related to history, some related to politics, some related to gaming, but really you're bound to expect basically something for everything, within the backlog of this channel. If that doesn't sound appealing to you, then I suggest you do whatever you want with the rest of your day, because it is your day after all. And yeah, that was it from me. So, until next time, I have been the One Take Man.